seorang anak perempuan berumur 13 tahun. Jadi seumuran dengan kita ini, Profesor Hans ini. Memperoleh Ph.D. pada tahun 2006 in Theological Ethics dengan judul Createdness and Ethics, the Doctrine of Creation and Theological Ethics in the Theology of Colin E. Gunton and Oswald Bayer. Pada tahun 2003 sampai 2011, Profesor Hans adalah seorang pendeta jemaat di Gereja Reform di Wechenen. Dan pada tahun 2011 mengajar Practical Theology, teologi praktika, di tempat di mana sekarang dia masih tetap mengajar, yaitu Theological University Kampen. Sejak tahun 2019, dia diangkat menjadi Professor of Practical Theology di Theological University Kampen. Ibu Bapak bisa mengecek publikasinya dalam bahasa Inggris bersama dengan Hans Schaeffer, Gerard Den Hertog, Stephen Pes, menerbitkan tulisan Mercy Theories, Concept and Practices. Kemudian terbitan lain termasuk buku dalam bahasa Belanda, Werk on Different Practice Theologies Reflecties of Kerkzin. Kira-kira itu tentang gereja yang beraksi atau yang hidup gitu. Teologi praktis refleksi dari menjadi gereja. Itu tahun 2019. This is what I can tell to the audience, Professor Hans. I talk good things about you, and now 60 minutes for you to give presentation, and this time is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Yusak, that I'm be able to join all of you in this very, very special occasion for me. I had already an invitation by Lenta to come over to Indonesia, but of course COVID changed all that. And I'm very pleased and thrilled to be part of your very interesting conference on intergenerational learning, intergenerational theology, how to be an intergenerational community as a church. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this wonderful program. Thank you so much. And I especially send my greetings also from our Institute, the Theological University Kampen, to all of you, and especially to those whom I might recognize by name on the screen. I can't, of course, see all of you or get to know all of you, but I'm very pleased that you are here and that you are joining us this afternoon for you and for me this early morning.
Yes.
I want to talk to you, and I'll share my screen in a minute, about a topic that you have already discussed over the past days, and you will continue to do that tomorrow. So it might be that you're much more experts on this than I am. And that is because a practical theologian is always cautious not to value the real practice, the practice that you are in your institutes, serving your students to learn and how to cope with intergenerational problems in the reality of church life and family life within your local communities. And as a practical theologian, I am only there to perhaps clarify some things and to make some things more visible to you. I cannot solve any real problems by myself. Neither can you. We can only do that by the power of God himself, who reigns over the earth and who reigns over his church. And in that confidence that he is with us, I would like to start my presentation. So here we are, generation theory, theological perspective, and in postmodern times. And another preliminary remark I have to make. When I talk about this topic, I talk only from my perspective, the West, a male, a white perspective. And that is, of course, to some degree similar to problems and phenomena you all encounter in your life, but it will also be different. And that is why I chose to speak to this on this topic in four parts, and they will all last about 10 minutes. First, setting the scene. What's going on in the West nowadays, as far as I can see and overview. Then about practical theology and postmodernity in the West. And then on the topic you are most interested in, generation theory, and the challenges that will pose us. And afterwards, I'm looking forward to hear your comments and your questions, of course. Setting the scene. We all, I think, know and experience that intergenerational connectivity, so the connections between the generations, are under pressure. And that has mostly to do because of the fact that change is rapidly increasing. There always has been change, and there always have been intergenerational issues. Fathers who did not like the behavior of their sons, mothers who didn't like what their daughters did. That is from all times. But the point is that in our age, globally, the change that every generation experiences is so rapidly increasing. Let me just give one example or two. The acceleration of growth in technology. If you see in the 1400s, so that is 600 years ago, until the start of the 20th century in 1900, that change was there, but it was slow. But within a century, such technological change has increased so very much. You can perhaps even decipher the text on it, the man on the moon, the microprocessor, how the cell phone evolved into the first 3D chip and 3D movies. And it's still a very steep line. And of course, most of us benefit from these developments. The fact that I can be part of your institute, Summer Institute now, is only because of these technological advancements. So it's not all bad, but the change and the pace in which things are changing puts generations under pressure. Another example, the globalization over 5 centuries in terms of trade. When you see how very rapidly this increased in the 20th century, it is almost unbelievable that before that, it was still going all that more slow. And the problem is that in the mindset of most global enterprises, in the mindset of most people, such increasing speed is valued positively. It is something we should achieve ever more, ever greater, ever bigger. And that is a problem for those who have experienced, who do not experience this change as something positive. They have to catch up. They have to deal with the problems it brings. Because of this rapid change in all areas of our lives, there is also an increasing diversity between and among generations, between and among, because within generations, things change as well. And people react to change in different ways. What diversity do we encounter? An increasing diversity in wealth distribution. That is not something new, but it's increasingly diversified because of the fact that local economies are increasingly dependent on global developments. So the level of wealth within generations and between generations is diversifying. Health problems. How do we deal with health? Whereas in former ages, most people had access to mostly the same kind of treatments. But nowadays, the rich have much more access to healthcare institutions. And that increases the diversity between those who are already rich and healthy and those who cannot afford to have such care. An increasing diversity with respect to education. Those who are not wealthy enough, are not healthy enough, will receive a completely different kind of education than those who have access to all those means. And of course, this is not new. This was already present in earlier ages, but it's now increasing locally and globally. And that creates tensions between and within generations. Increasing diversity because of religious tensions. You will have that experience even much bigger than I in the Netherlands, of course. But there is an increasing tension between ages and between generations with respect to religion. I will come to that later on in my presentation. Ethnicity. People from the Black Lives Matter movement and all the discussions about the colonial past of the West show that the issue of ethnicity is really on our agenda. In the West, especially, but perhaps as well in Indonesia, the increasing diversity with respect to gender identity. The LGBTQ community is striving for its own rights and for people to be heard and seen. And it's not only somewhere in some places, it's global, it's worldwide. We all in different ways experience these diversity and this increasing diversity within countries, within local communities, and between generations. It is everywhere, and most of us have and experience these tensions. So increasing diversity also increases tensions. That means that churches and families need to learn to cope, to deal with this, how to react. We have to learn that. And learning, as you have already, I guess, established during this seminar, this conference of yours, includes formation. It's not about just knowledge, cognitive knowledge. It's about formation. We have to be formed as whole human beings in a way of life. And formation consists of two things. You have to have a worldview, a way of looking at things, a way of having a starting point, how to begin with, what is your direction, what is our aim. And from my perspective, for instance, it is a reformed perspective, a Christian perspective. And that is my worldview. But that is not enough. We do not deal and hand over to others a worldview, an abstract set of cognitions. We have to have our own practices, practices of being together, of how to live, practices in which we practice what we preach. And that is why such a worldview and practices need community. A community in which we belong together, in which we bridge gaps in which we connect to one another. Communities that are not a kind of paradise lost, a kind of paradise regained within the limits of our human age now. Community is a concrete community, the community of yours, the community of churches and families. That is what we need. So this is very briefly the scene: increasing diversity on all levels. That increases tensions, and we have to learn to cope with this, how to deal with this issue, these phenomena. And my conviction is that we can only overcome this and deal with this in and within the community of churches and community of families. And I will explain why. And that is when I turn to practical theology. That is my research area and teaching area. If you would have asked a biblical theologian to deal with this, he or she would have said other issues and said other things. My perspective is that of the practical theology and the context of what I would call postmodernity in the West. And when I speak about practical theology, I have to give some clarification on that. What do I mean by practical theology? And I here build on a definition by John Swinton and Harriet Mowat in their book, Practical Theology and Qualitative Research from 2006. Practical theology is critical theological reflection. So it is reflection. It is a second order discipline. It's not the practices themselves. It is reflection on the practices of the church as they interact with the practices of the world, with a view to ensuring and enabling faithful participation in God's redemptive practices into and for the world. It is about practices. As I said earlier, we have to deal and to cope with increasing diversity and tensions. And we need, therefore, those practices. And the concept of practice is at the core of practical theology. A practice is something we do together over time. It's not, of course, I can do practices on my own. But in the end, I am dependent for those practices on the whole of the community. Of course, I can pray at home. I can read my Bible. But in order to do so well, I have to be in contact with others, to pray with others as well, and to read the Bible together in order to gain the right perspective, to gain insights from God, to be criticized. I need the church and the practices of the church. They are the setting from which my private practices derive. And we interact with the practices of the world, for we do not live on an island. Christians are not living on their own. They interact in all kinds of ways with practices of the world, and because practices are formative, they form who we are. By doing things, by learning how to do things, I am formed and informed as a human being. I do not get my formation only from the church, but also from the world, from what others do. The heavy impact of society and of the values of society, how to deal with wealth, how to deal with money, how to strive for power, how to use power. That is heavily influenced not only by the church, but also by how the world deals with this. So they interact with one another. And the goal is faithful participation in God's practices. But because it is my conviction that God himself is at work through his Holy Spirit within this world. And we have to learn to be part of that practice of God himself, his redemptive practices. And the word redemption here is a key issue. Redemption is about relationships. And of course, the first relation we talk about is the relation with God, but also with one another, with all those intergenerational tensions that have increased over the last 50, 60 years. And then if this is practical theology in my conviction, and as I teach it here in Kampen, we have to deal with the context in which we live. And I phrase that as postmodernism. The problem is that postmodernism is mainly about epistemology. It is about what can we know for sure. And well, that is your opinion. My opinion is different. Look at all those Twitter bubbles and Facebook bubbles that exist, in which people only know and want to know what they already know. They are all encountering the same opinions over and over again because we think that there is no truth and that I just have to deal with that on my own to find my way into this world. And that is because epistemology is also about authority. And especially in the West, we have a huge problem with authority. That is different in other cultures, but the West is heavily under the influence of an anti-authoritarian strand within society. We do not like others to say what we should believe or what we should think. Especially since the 1960s, this is a heavy problem within our society. And because we have no authority, the concept of truth has vanished. There is no truth. You cannot know the truth. You have to find your own way. I found on the internet a very illustrative picture of postmodernity that it is this one. In the pre-modern times, we thought of our lives as dots because God put it there and that's the way it has always been. That is how the pre-modern societies were organized. In modernity, that is since the Enlightenment and perhaps a little bit earlier, of course, but the modern times, so let's say from the late 1600s at the earliest until the World War II, there was the conviction that we should strive for growth, onwards and upwards with inevitable progress. And postmodernity has changed all that. There is no such thing as one direction. We are just scrabbling on our screens. And if you look at the text, it is it's nothing. It's just a bit of letters. That's all that is there. And postmodernism gave way to secularization. And I here build on the work of Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, religious philosopher, who wrote very influential books on the sources of the self and on our age, the age of secularization. And he distinguished 3 types of secularization. And the first is the most visible one. Within the West, God has disappeared from society. Church is marginalized. That's the second one, but it's also, he is not present. People simply are not going to church. He has no influence in the public life. he is vanishing from society. And the second kind of secularism is the eclipse of the church. Because of this secularism, the church and church life vanished as well. In the West, in the Netherlands, there are hundreds and hundreds of churches that either have been torn down or changed into bookstores or apartments to live in, or just workshops, if it's a very small church, a workshop for a painter. Churches are eclipsing. But the most deep form of secularization is the third one. It is really something that Charles Taylor invented, so to say, and made visible, that and wrote about the intense consequences of this third kind of secularism. It is the option, the thinkability, that it is thinkable that God does not exist. That is something that generations and generations before us did not even have. Of course, God was present, but there has become an option that God does not exist. And people now, our youth in the Netherlands, are growing up in a climate in which believing or not believing are both options. You can either believe or not believe, and even not believing is a thinkable option, a reasonable option. Why should you believe? And this development, this change, is so rapidly spreading over our society that it is very hard not to become under the influence of it. And especially those generations who are raised now are so heavily influenced in all ways, in the schooling system, in the way companies advertise, in the way people organize their free time, their leisure time, the way in which people are trained to think in the news, in the media. In all ways, this third secularization is present and affects especially the younger generations that are not firmly rooted in the pre-modern or the modern period. Well, if I've just sketched the scene, set the scene of the West, we talked about practical theology and how to do practical theology and postmodernism and secularization in the West. The third part of my presentation is now about generation theory. Because given the scene with its rapid changes and its tensions and changes within and between generations, and because of the context of postmodernism and secularization, and from the perspective of practical theology, that is, reflection on practices of church and world in interaction, and because of the need of communities of faith like church and families, the question is, what can generation theory bring us? And in order to give at least a little bit of an answer to this, I need a little bit more of practical theology. I'm so sorry. What is a practical theological perspective on intergenerational tensions? Well, firstly, we have to really describe carefully and lovingly what is going on in our church and in our families. And I saw on your program announced at least presentation of research among young members of Christian communities. And that is so very valuable, within the Western context, very recently, this year, a phenomenal book was published by Ruth Perrin. It's called Changing Shape, the Faith Lives of Millennials. And you might even in your context benefit from what is written there. Of course, there may be very many differences, but there might be similarities as well. And I can provide the title for you later on. So, because that is also research on what is going on. And we have to do that carefully and lovingly. There is always the tendency to do this in a pejorative way, that we are not glad with developments, that we we dislike what is going on. But first of all, we have to be very loving and careful about this description phase. And secondly, we have to analyze thoroughly, why is this going on? What is the reason? Why is it? What brings people to behave like that, to do things like this? And in the third place, we have to discover what normative framework might be useful to assess all these things in order to answer the question, what should be going on? And in the fourth place, we have to take shared leadership responsibility to define what then should we do. And all those four phases are written out more in detail by Rick Osmer in his Practical Theology, which I use very much in my teaching. It's a very interesting and readable book on practical theology. Well, then, we have to priestly listen. What is going on locally? And I emphasize this locally because of the rapid changes and the rapidly increasing diversity, there might be very many differences between local communities, even within one region or in one country, and especially, of course, when it concerns the situation in Indonesia, which is such a huge country compared to the Netherlands. But even within the Netherlands, we have to be very specific and local. There are many factors that influence church life and family life on a local level. So we can and may benefit from insights from worldwide studies and global studies, but we really have to investigate what's going on locally. And that means that we have to listen to the people. We require sagely wisdom to answer the question, why is this going on? And those words, priestly and sagely, are by Rick Osmer, and they characterize our attitude. How do we do things? We do not just listen as psychologists or as managers, but we listen as priests. Priests who are really informed by God himself and like God listening. We do not need the wisdom of autocrats who simply define what should be going on. No, we have to listen and to understand, and that requires wisdom, sagely wisdom. Why is this? We need curiosity. And we need prophetic discernment. And as we all know, prophets are not made, they are appointed. They are appointed by the community, by God, through the community. Not everyone is able to discern prophetically. So we have to really look for prophetic discernment. What ought to be going on? It's not the right of the strongest, the survival of the fittest that should be going on. But you should really listen to what individuals and generations need. And we need servant leadership. how might we respond? And all four are theological tasks. Theological in the sense that they are guided by God and aimed at serving God. And all four tasks are aided by other sciences. So we have to deal with both theology and the other sciences. Well, let me now make that concrete by going into the idea of generation theory. Generation theory defines generation as a group of individuals of similar ages whose members have experienced a noteworthy historical event within a set period of time. We also may call that a cohort. I don't know if that term is familiar. In the West, it's usually used for the army, but you can also speak of a cohort as sociologically. It's a cohort that is shaped and informed in its values, in its behavior, in how it thinks, how it lives, by specific social and cultural phenomena. Well, this is a kind of formal definition of what a generation is, and it stems from the work of the Hungarian-German sociologist Karl Mannheim. And he found out in his research in the late 20s that there is a difference between a generation or cohort and kinship and family, whereas in earlier times, people tended to think about family and kinship as the main influential factor. It turned out that, at least in his days, generations and cohorts that were shaped by certain sociological events were as influential as family life and kinship. That means that instead of a historical stratification of society through the ages, through the times, from the past into the future, a vertical relation stratification, now a horizontal stratification became much more influential. How people are distributed among society and within local communities, how they are distributed with respect to their generation became very important. For instance, the cities in which many people went to work and to live. The average age of the cities in the early 20th century decreased. Much younger people tended to get to live within the cities. And on the countryside, so to say, all the old ones stayed. And that meant a real and huge difference in society as we knew it before. Instead of the historical stratification between the generations and the impact of family and kinship, now the cohort and the generation became the most important. To just add a few other technical words, scientific words, it is about not the connections that are diachronic, but those that are synchronic. But you may as well forget these. That is a generation in the definition of Mannheim. Let's see what it brings. A cohort that is shaped and informed by specific social cultural phenomena. Yes, because there was a huge change. From horse and carriage, we became familiar with cars. From just a radio, we entered the age of television. From the telegraph, it turned in one century to our cell phones. From typewriters to computers. From computers to tablets. And with regard to my context, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, or the attack on the Twin Towers, became massive influential factors on our generation, on the generation I'm part of. And in the West, we can divide between several generations. We have the baby boomers born after the Second World War, between 45 and 60. Then we have Generation X, born between 60 and 80, who experienced or are influenced by the roaring 60s, whereas their elders were influenced by all the consequences, the direct consequences of World War II and the rebuilding of Europe and the reshaping of Europe. The next generation was shaped by the roaring 60s and all the influences that occurred there. Then we have Generation Y, or the millennials, who experienced and for whom the end of the Cold War between Russia and the West was very, very influential. And then Generation Z, we call it, born from 1995 to, well, to let's say 2015, who are children of the World Wide Web, the internet, those who are digital natives. It is their surrounding. And each generation interacts in a specific way, and that is very important to understand. Each generation interacts in a specific way to cultural change in the present. It reacts in a different way to, well, let's say, developments like a computer. My grandfather, he died in 1996, never had a computer. He didn't know how to deal with it. And those who are very old now had really to cope and deal with using a computer or a cell phone. And it was very hard for them to understand how it, not only how it works technically, but also the change it brings. My father, he's 78 and he lives in Germany. So that is, from my perspective, far away. He doesn't use a cell phone because he doesn't like it. So I cannot text him. I cannot use WhatsApp with him. We have to do things by email or telephone. But on the other hand, he is a scholar and he really uses the internet a lot. And he has managed to keep up with the developments of the internet. Each generation also interacts in a specific way to former generations and upcoming generations. It's not that every generation interacts in the same way with former or upcoming generations. Each generation does that in a different way because they are formed and shaped differently. Well, now some answers to the questions we need to ask. What is going on? That's the first task and question of theology, between and within generations. Well, we have to lovingly and carefully describe the different values generations have, different behavior they have developed over time. We have to make sure what authority issues might be at stake within the discussion. So that is our first task, to provide a real loving and caring picture of what is going on and between generations. That is a task for theologians, not just something we might do as well, but it is a task. What is going on? And we have to find an answer on the question of why. Of course, all authority issues are inherent, are always part of nurture and education. It's not something new and not something different as such. But what specific issues do you encounter within your student population, within your church lives and families? And we have to educate our students to answer these questions. What specific issues do they encounter in their churches, in their cultural life? And what goal do people set? Is it autonomy, which is a very influential goal set by our society? Or is it conformity? Just conform to older generations? Is that what we should do? And why issues arise? Be sure, I cannot provide answers. I only think that I pose some useful questions. The third question is, what should be going on? What normative guidelines do we discover in the Bible? And what normativity from other sciences do we discover? Because the great and most big question is, how can we empower generations and intergenerational community? And I just go very quickly and briefly through developmental psychology. How do we grow up, and what are the insights from other sciences? And most of you are familiar with the several stages of growing up by Erik Erikson, and the questions that poses to us. The questions about the continuity and discontinuity between each phase of each stage of growing older. The question of what is the influence of nurture versus the influence of nature. How can we really influence other people? The longing for stability on the one hand and change on the other hand. We have to be dependent. We are dependent on our parents, especially in our earlier stages of our lives, but we grow to an increasing independence. That is insightful information we can use to understand what should be going on and why things are going on. But we also have to look for theology. What has theology, what has the Bible to say about intergenerationality? It might be the case, and I'm not sure, but as far as my Western view is concerned, this is very true. We tend to focus on intergenerational conformity, that each generation conforms to the older ones, that we do what the elders did. Because of the very fact that we focus on reconciliation and redemption, things should be fine. And well, who's the one who says what is fine? That is the parent, the father, the mother, or the church leader. We tend to focus on conformity. Yeah, if you do this, then things will be all right. But then look at Psalm 78, the most impressive psalm on intergenerationality. My people hear my teaching. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord. He commanded to teach the children, so the next generation would know God's commandments. They would not be like their ancestors. They would not be like their ancestors. That is strange. That is interesting. The Bible doesn't talk and tell and teach conformity everywhere and always. The Bible teaches that each generation should learn to know God's commandments and not be like their ancestors. I cannot go into full detail about this, but it means, and here I come back to the research of Art Bontekoe, a Dutch psychologist who wrote on generations, and I just listed the English article, most important English article for you, who says that each generation has to find its own way. Its own way because the circumstances change. The answers our forefathers gave to certain questions are not per se the right answers for our generation, for new generations. Each generation has to find its own way, but, and that is very important, each generation needs the support from other generations. from the older ones as well as from the younger ones. We need each other. I cannot go into detail on why is this the case, but it is researched and it is evidence-based that this is true for every generation. You have to find your own way, but you have to support one another. And that brings me to the last part of my presentation, the challenges. It is just a picture of an intergenerational multicultural church. So there are churches that really focus on being intergenerational. And I think that here we Christians have a huge capital we can use to deal with the intergenerational problems, because we are the only intergenerational institution within our society. A football club is not intergenerational per se, at least not the players. You can be a fan, a huge fan of a football club, of course, until a high age, but to play football, in order to play football, yeah, well, I don't know if people in their 70s and 80s still playing soccer in a very good, well way. Let me say and state the individual, the challenges, because God cares about each and everyone individually in a fallen world characterized by sin. God aims at transformation, the coming kingdom, transformation of individual lives, of families and communities, of society. And if God aims at transformation, we cannot say, yes, but we always used to. No, we need prophetic discernment and sagely wisdom to say, well, if God aims at transformation, we should aim at transformation as well. What exactly the continuity is between generations, or the discontinuity, is something we have to discern, we have to look after, we have to establish. And of course, intergenerational tensions are part of that process. We cannot find our way without tensions. We need to be a community that really deals with these tensions in a Christian way. We, the Christian community, should not say, just obey me. We should be a community in which we can reflect, in which we can think, in which we can search for the kingdom of God, because none of our generations is the owner of God's kingdom. We are always looking for God's kingdom, searching God's kingdom, and searching we do together. Together means not and either this generation has the truth or that generation. We have to be able to and we have to do it together, because each generation has to find its way into God's kingdom. Now then, on the formation of church leadership, what is important for church leadership now? That we should really empower each generation. Focus on understanding each generation and the individuals within the generations. And look for common ground within and between generations. What do we all long for? And therefore we need to take our time, especially when change and diversity is increasing so rapidly. We have to take time. And with regard to intergenerational conflicts, be realistic. They existed in each and every society, and in our time in a specific way. Yes, that's true. well, deal with it. Do not tend to focus on the picture of the church or of families as paradise. We do not have any paradise left. A family and a church, well, yes, they suffer from tensions. Be real. That is the case. But teach your students to become interpretive guides. And I owe this to Gherkin and Osma in the book I mentioned. People who know, who are guides, who know what the people are, how they behave, how they. A guide should know the flock. And he should know, or she should know, where things are going. And then churches and families. The church and should be a safe haven. Not because everything is perfect within our churches, but it should be the surrounding in which families can learn how to become intergenerational, an intergenerational community. Our families can discuss, what should I do with my 70-year-old boy? Not that the church provides all the answers, but there should be a place in which you can talk about this. A safe haven is not an ideal community in which no tensions exist. It is a place where we can really acknowledge and discuss what is going on and what tensions we face. Because the church is a learning community. We are disciples of Jesus Christ, and disciples always have to learn. And yes, the church is special because it is an intergenerational community by itself. In the church, older people and younger people live together. And if anywhere, then in the church, they should be able to be empowered to find their own way and to be supported by other generations, like Bonte Koning said. So far for me, that is the end of my presentation. I hand over the floor to the president now, and I will stop sharing my screen.
So thank you, Professor Hans, for the presentation. Your presentation is very challenging for us and for theological education in Indonesia, because it focuses on what is happening in the present and how the church and theological education must deal with it. This challenge suggests of the responsibility of theology to deal with. And also, this presentation is very urgent and important because it connects practical theology, the theory of generation, postmodern phenomena, and the generation gap and tension, and what is implication for us and also in theological education. Bapak Ibu, I think it's better if we have 5 until 7 or 10 minutes break for tea time. And please raise question in the chatting room. As I look at the chatting room, there are about 9 questions. And I think this question will be increased while we have take a break. Well, Professor Hans, please do take your time for enjoy your tea, and then we'll back again after 7 or 10 minutes. Terima kasih Ibu Bapak untuk pertanyaan-pertanyaannya. Nanti akan saya sampaikan atau Profesor Hans akan langsung menjawab pertanyaan dari Ibu Bapak sekalian. So don't leave the virtual reality room. And would you like to have your tea first, Professor Hans? Let's take a break.
I'll just fetch a cup of, well, it's morning, so I'll do my coffee.
Okay.
But,
all right.
I will come back.
Okay, good.
I will come back.
Ya. Oke, Bapak Ibu, sementara Profesor Hans akan menikmati kopi, jangan tinggalkan ruangan ini, tetapi bisa saja Ibu Bapak menyampaikan pertanyaan secara langsung, nanti saya akan mencoba untuk menuliskannya, menambahkan 9 pertanyaan yang sudah ada pada ruang chatting. Atau langsung saja masuk ke ruang chatting dan memberikan pertanyaan. Kalau bisa dalam bahasa Inggris, semoga agar cepat pertanyaan-pertanyaan dan komentar bisa ditanggapi dengan cepat. Mari silahkan sambil menikmati teh dan kopi. Di Indonesia ini juga perlu kopi pada jam kritis seperti ini, terutama di waktu Indonesia bagian timur ini sudah menjelang jam 4 lebih ya. Di Manado ini jam 3 dan di Netherlands sekarang jam 9 pagi. Silahkan istirahat sebentar sambil juga kalau ada pertanyaan silahkan lakukan di ruang chatting. Jangan lupa Ibu Bapak mengisi presensi atau absensi yang sudah disediakan oleh Pak Haryadi, staf dari Persetia. Silahkan melakukan presentasi melalui format yang telah disediakan. Selama 1 jam berlangsung, masih ada beberapa teman yang baru saja masuk di ruang virtual ini.
Itu karena sinyal nggak stabil, Pak.
Oh ya, betul.
Terlempar keluar, harus join kembali berkali-kali gitu.
Ya, sangat bisa dipahami. Now we are dealing with internet connection in Indonesia, Professor Hans, because the quality of internet connection is not the same from place to place in Indonesia. So some participants leaving the virtual meeting and then enter again and so on and so on. So that is our challenge in this situation. But so far it's going well. And we just collect a question for you. Would you like to read by yourself in the chatting room, or because if I read them, then it takes time. So,
yeah. There are a lot of questions,
yes.
Which is a great. I like that very much.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just write down some of the main topics that are present in most of the questions that might help.
Oh, enjoy your coffee first.
Well, it's working time. I like it. I like that.
It's 2 o'clock p.m. in Indonesia in the Western time. So it's siesta time actually, but but we are coping with this. We survive.
Yeah. Okay. How are the weather conditions where you are? I don't know where is Persetia now? It's in Yogyakarta.
I live in Salatiga, but Lenta is living in Jakarta.
Yeah.
And among 130 participants are in all over Indonesia. So it's very interesting situation. And the internet connection, Zoom, make this communal in Christ become a reality.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just reading.
Yep.
Disuruh makin lama deh.
So Professor Hans, you ready?
I am.
Oke. Ibu Bapak yang saya hormati, kita akan memulai kembali sesi kita dengan tanya jawab. Pertanyaannya sudah dikolek di ruang chatting dan Pak Hans sudah membaca pertanyaan-pertanyaan Ibu Bapak dalam bahasa Inggris yang jumlahnya sekarang ada 9 pertanyaan, dan pertanyaan yang terakhir 89 itu dari Pak Surbakti dan Pak Tuhoni itu sangat panjang, tapi pasti akan dijawab oleh Professor Hans. Professor Hans, that's yours. The time is yours. Please satisfy your audience with your answer and comments that will be brought to you. Okay, that's yours.
Those are very high expectations. And I certainly cannot meet them.
Okay.
But I'll try to do my best. There are several questions in the chat already on on at least two things: the differences between Indonesia and the West. And of course, they are huge. And I am not that familiar with your situation. And I think it's important to understand that what answers I might have are Western answers. They apply to my context. Maybe in your context, we have different answers because the questions might be different. And that makes me a little bit hesitant in saying, well, you should do this or you should do that. And that is exactly why, for me, it is very helpful to have those 4 questions. I'm not giving answers, I'm posing the questions. And I think they are right in itself everywhere. What is going on? What is really going on in your churches, in your family life? And why, and what should be, and how to deal with that. And as you are teaching in seminaries, you are teaching students to become ministers for this church. It is, I think, even also your responsibility to ask those questions to your students and provide them with answers. In my institution in the Netherlands, Theological University Kampen, I teach my students to become the persons who ask these kind of questions within their congregations. And we educate them that they are able and have the concrete tools to investigate these questions within the communities they already serve. And it is increasingly important within my field, within practical theology, that we teach the students to become those guides within their community, that they are able to find out what is going on in their situation. So that is, I cannot say that answers we have found in the Netherlands apply to you. And that brings me to a second point. What kind of diversity do I speak of? As there were some questions in the chat about that. When I talk about diversity, I use it in a very broad sense. Differences between people, differences between groups, differences in income, differences in education level, all kinds of differences occur. And of course, in earlier times, those differences were present as well. We have always had rich people and poor people. But the problem is that what in earlier times was a relatively stable distribution of that. There were people who were rich, and usually they stayed rich. And there were people who were poor, and they stayed poor. And that was a kind of way how to deal with it. But because of the increasing changes in the level of education, the accessibility of education in the West, there has been an interesting phenomenon that people who earlier on in early generations were raised as poor people, they now had the chance after the 60s to become educated and earn more money. Just very recently, this week, there was a report published by some institute here in the Netherlands on the differences in income and wealth, etc. And it stated very interestingly that still it is true that if you are born in certain areas in the Netherlands, the expectations that you can become a successful teacher or lawyer or whatever are diminishing. So it really is still the case that even within our Western society, people are born in a way that they cannot overcome the gaps. And I think that is true still and will be true for many areas in the world, that the way you were born defines how you will live. And the problem with that is that it creates tensions because there is an ideology in the whole of our world, global ideology, that if you do your best, that you will have success. And if you just work hard, you can become this or that. There is an ideology that you are entitled, that you have a right for education and successful life and money and happiness. We are entitled to have luck and happiness in our lives. And because of that very strong and influential ideology that is completely anti-authoritarian, it is against authorities, it is about you, it is about your development and your individual growth. That ideology is defeating its thousands and millions. And it is only about empowering you yourself and not on your contribution to others and other generations and other people. And that ideology of capitalism in the West is increasingly all over the world. And it is an ideology because it states that if you are not successful, it's your fault. And that creates tensions, that makes people angry and frustrated. Well, what can generation theory then bring? It brings understanding that the youths within your communities are raised and drinking in this ideology. And it helps you to counter that within your churches and your education with other more Christian values. And one of the core issues then is grace. The grace of God. We live by grace. We do not live by achievements. And that is a gospel that has, of course, been present for centuries, but it is very helpful to say that and to teach that in your seminaries and in your communities and churches. Well, I can go on to tell about this much longer, but that doesn't help you that much. Let me see if I scroll through the chat, or perhaps one of the presidents could pose a question that he or she thinks is valuable now. With respect to the situation in the Netherlands, yes, churches are in decline. That is a very, I'm just looking up some information on how things are in the Netherlands nowadays. There was a recent research in 2015 that stated that there are just 14%, so 14%, not 40, but 14% says they are atheist. So it's not, that's including Islam and the Jewish religion. 14%. There are 28% that believe in something. 34 are agnostic, and 24 call themselves atheists. I can share this with you as well sometime, but that's not the main point. Since the year 2000, every day, churches, all Christian churches, have 267 quittings of church membership. Each day, 267 people quit. And the amount of churchgoers in weekends is decreasing by 37,000 per year. 25% still of the population reckons itself to be Christian. But that is, of course, a broad affiliation. People can say that they are Christian and not do anything with it. It's still 25%. The problem is that those people do not go to church very well. If you count membership, church membership, you already say, have to say that 11% is Catholic, 9% Reformed of the biggest, and 4% in a smaller community. So that is a very small proportion. In some, it is, let me count, 12, 21, 25%. That is, but the amount of churchgoers is much less, because of the people who say that they are Roman Catholic or Protestant, there are sometimes 30 or 40% who are agnostic. So they still are counted as church, but they are agnostic. So the field is, it's dramatic. One of you stated, I was in the Netherlands and I visited a small church, and there was just one child coming forward to receive a blessing. And he was the only child. And that's true. We are losing our younger generation. And of course, there are differences between churches. Some churches do it better than other churches. But overall, we are very much in decline. How to respond to this? Well, if I should have the right answer, I was going to be a millionaire by now, because I could just sell it. I do not have the answer. I do not have that there is an answer, because it's not manageable. What I think is very important, that earlier on, we had the idea that in church, everything should go very, very smoothly, and that there should not be any tension within the church. We are very bad, we Christians are very bad at quarreling with one another. Because either we do it in a very bad way, or we do not do it at all. But it's very hard to have differences of opinion within a church. And that is strange. If we look at the Gospels, we see Jesus rebuking the disciples. We see the disciples quarreling among each other. We see them asking questions to Jesus and to each other. They are looking, they're searching, and that is all part of the game. We should trust God more, I think, that he can manage to use our differences, our questions, to provide a way of dealing with this. And one of the things, I come back to that, is just ask one another, what is going on? Tell me how you feel, what you want. And I think that if we search for that question, what do you really want? And do you really want that? Or is that something you want because of how society teaches you to do things? That on that level, you can really bring about a conversation and going on to be a community. There was also a question, and that struck me when reading through the chat. Please, give me a second. Yes, that is a question. As an educator from the West, what do you see in the Indonesian context, the educators from the East, both disadvantages and advantages, potentials and obstacles that we have regarding the implementation of intergenerational education in religious affairs? I think that you have a huge advantage over the West in that we in the West are so characterized by secularization and postmodernism that it is hard for older generations to be supportive of younger ones, because they really do not trust older generations. And I think that it might be the case that within your culture, there still is more reverence for older generations, more intergenerational connectivity than in the West. And that is something you can use, but then not to impose conformity to the older generations, but to empower the new generations by giving them a certain portion of responsibility. If you, as older generations, give responsibility to others and be there, ask, priestly listen to what they want and what their plans are, you might really be able to discover that God's Spirit is working in a marvelous way among those younger generations, doing things coming up with solutions and new ways and plans that you had never dreamt of, but that God gives his power and his talents to these younger people to deal with things in a new way. And if you are supportive in that, and if you support their use of their talents, and of course that also means correction in some ways, but be supportive is of key importance in dealing with younger generations. Give them responsibility and credibility. I think that is something you might be done easier in your circumstances than in our circumstance. I think that there is a common misunderstanding in the church, and that is that hesitation, not knowing answers, is valued as bad. That reflection that takes time and that is that puts your own position under scrutiny, people can evaluate you, that is considered a weakness. There is the ideal that we should be strong, that we know everything, that we know where we will go on. And I think that is almost globally a strong tendency, that we value those characteristics highly. Whereas within the church, we should have learned to be reflective and ask questions. Am I right? Am I doing it right? Is it true that? Do I really think that? And all those reflective questions are not a sign of weakness, but they are signs of discipleship. If we are truly disciples of Jesus Christ, we have to ask ourselves, is it right? Is this good? Please tell me. If we really believe, like the apostle said in his epistle to the Corinthians, that God distributes talents and gifts and charisms unto the whole of the community, then we should use them. And that means, of course, that if we really use them and if people say things and ask questions, that tensions will arise. Yeah, that's true. But that's not bad. We just have to deal with it in a Christian way. And what is the Christian way then? Well, the letter of Paul to the Philippians, chapter 2, conformity to Jesus Christ what Paul writes there in that the ending of the first and the beginning of the second chapter of the letter to the people in Philippia is very of a huge importance to us, that we value the other more than ourselves. And that's even true for us who are in leadership. If we are really truly disciples, we are a learning community. And that is something that we should, and we are learning till we die. I mean, that's not something that is finished when you're 60 or 70 or 40. It's continuing.
Professor Hans, there are some questions that need to be answered.
Please.
Yes.
Tell them.
We have another question from David Setyawan. That's okay. Denny Andri Taruminggi and Andar Palindungan. Maybe you need to answer this question from Andar Palindungan. The postmodern reality in the West seems to be contrary with the religious situation in the global East. So since there are church religious boomings in these continents, according to the statistic, how can we differentiate this reality of postmodernism? That is from Pak Andar Palindungan. Hello, Pak Andar. Hello, you are in German right now. And Lamberti Mandagi, Pak Lamberti Mandagi, how are the efforts of the churches in the Netherlands, especially Kampen University, in implementing intergeneration education in a postmodern era where more and more people are leaving the church? And the third, Mary Ginting, how the attitude of the theological seminary in Indonesia in the face of secularism in this postmodern period. I think the third question has been answered by you, but the second, the two, the first two questions need to be answered.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there is a religious booming in other parts of the world, and in the West it is in decline. The most recent numbers, however, that have been distributed by the Pew Center and the other Center for the United States, they show that even the booming is not as booming as we might think still. So even globally, there has been a topping off of that increase in other parts of the world. So I don't think that that the West is the only region that suffers from postmodernism and secularization. I fear that because of the global spread of capitalism and the consequences of that ideology, that also other parts of the world will suffer from things we are suffering now. I'm afraid. So you might just take a look on how bad it is in the West to see something of that, something that might happen as well in other parts of the world. I'm not a prophet. I cannot predict the future. But that is, and that is why you have to differentiate exactly as Andar suggests between different realities of postmodernism. The way in which we suffer from postmodernism might be different from yours. I'm not an expert in intercultural theology and how the cultures of this world differ among each other. I only think that having conferences like this, that as you do on intergenerational learning, that may open the eyes for the fact that there are different generations and that you can use them within your theological education and within your churches. So that might really be of help just to empower the generations. And by doing that, you will differentiate postmodernism. It will turn out how things will be in your local context. The second question is, what do we do in the Netherlands, at my university, in implementing intergenerational education? Increasingly, we focus on what we call small groups or cell groups or families in different, living close by each other to become a tight group. So we do not tend to focus on the church services only, and they have to be closed down because of the COVID pandemic now, but to focus on those small structures of small groups. And within these small groups, it is much easier to give attention to children, to youth, in theory. But in practice, it's not. Because I don't know how things are, but a boy of 16, 17 doesn't like to be part of a conversation on something that is mainly for older people, for adults. And so you still have to, you have to do two things. The first is organize intergenerational meetings on a small scale, like having a barbecue together or eating together, meals, in which that same 70-year-old boy is suddenly confronted with that 6-year-old boy who is looking up to this great, strong boy and who can help him playing football. And there is a connection then between the 6-year-old and the 70-year-old. And if then a father joins in playing football with those two boys, it may be a great event. Just to give a small example. So intergenerational, easy events. And secondly, you have to invest in stratified education. So really bring together the age groups, organize things for and within themselves, that they can find that peer group reliable, but it is a peer group that is led by older people, not father, not a mother, but someone else who is not part, who's not a family member of anyone in that group, so that they have a different, how do you call that? Identification figure within the church, that they can really identify with someone else. So invest in intergenerational meetings and in stratified education and teaching.
All right, there are three another questions that need to be answered. One is from Pelita Surbakti. Based on your explanation that PT, practical theology, is very concerned with the context. So what is the difference between practical theology and contextual theology? That is question number one. And question number two from Reverend Tuhoni Telaumba from NIAS. Thanks, allow me to reflecting on your presentation and blah, blah, blah. And could you please share with us what concepts and programs of educational institutions and churches in addressing the problems that have arisen by these changes are carrying out? We would like also to hear the experiences of churches and educational institutions in Europe in the midst of postmodern and now with the COVID-19 pandemic. And question number three, from Novi Sine, will this pandemic situation affect our view of ecclesiology and practical theology? And how does the generation theory persist amid during in this pandemic situation? We have another question, but these are the first three questions.
Yeah,
that's yours.
There is a difference between practical theology and contextual theology. That contextual theology, let me say it this way, the way of doing practical theology might be and has to be very contextual. So in a sense, giving room for context is key to practical theology. If we really would like to reach the local situation, we really have to adjust and focus on what's going on in that context. But contextual theology in general tends to be more systematic. It tends to focus on ideas and how they are locally believed. And practical theology is concerned with transforming practices of the church. So that is my short answer to this question. And in a sense, both are a consequence of postmodernism in the fact that through postmodernism and secularization and post-colonialism, we have discovered in the West that knowledge is contextual. Immanuel Kant thought that there were universally applicable rules and we now are less sure about that. The second question is about what programs do we have for addressing the intergenerational problems. We have divided the tasks a little bit. The university is teaching the teachers, and we have a research center that develops material for intergenerational faith growth within churches. And they are, as I said, increasingly focused on intergenerational connectivity. So build and make small groups that really interact with one another intergenerationally in leisure things and providing a context for encounters, and develop a strong stratified educational program. And there is a lot of content that is offered to churches to help them pursuing this.
Okay.
We have a problem with regard to COVID, of course, especially in the first month of the pandemic. Small groups, even church groups, small groups didn't convene. It was not possible. And now, fortunately, young people are still able to attend their groups, but things are going bad in the Netherlands. And I don't know whether that will be able to be done in the coming month or weeks. We will know this evening. There will be a press conference by our Prime Minister. And yes, the pandemic situation really changes our way of being church. We cannot convene for church services. And that used to be the center around which we did our church life. We have to really invest in those small scale intergenerational meetings, because that is still to a certain extent possible. The problem is that such meetings, according to my opinion, cannot substitute those church services, because it is something else to have a barbecue or a meal than to praise God by singing and reading the Bible and praying intergenerationally.
All right. There are some questions. So your presentation are very challenging, so that it raised a lot of questions. And I will read another question because the time is running and we just have 15 more minutes. So I will read the question briefly. It's from a question from Fania. She asks you, does the future of the church in Netherlands is only belong to the old generation? There's a challenging question. And from Julie van Harefa, I think you did answer. And from Mary Ginting, what kind of learning model is the theological seminary providing in the context of intergeneration, in the context of this COVID-19 pandemic? You allude to this question. And Andreas Pugiono, what is impacts to our church if we avoid needs? If we avoid needs Generation Z for 5 or 10 years later, okay, what impact to our churches if we avoid needs Generation Z? Okay, and Anne Juniawati, how seminary curriculum can help church leaders in the future to have intergenerational perspective in dealing with families in the church? From Dr. John Thor, how many % now the people in your country still convinced, believe that God is their God and Savior? Okay, okay. There's from Dr. Justicia Fox de Hatu. The question is, I would love to listen to your perspective on this, as well as Osmar's perspective in concerning on Osmar's 4 steps that you use as a perspective to understand intergenerational tension in your presentation. And the next from Rohni Pasusinaga, how to integrate the differences in postmodern in your campus and church, so no gap between old and new generation. This is a question, a lot of questions that bring about to the table to you. Please, Professor Hans.
Yeah, I will just try to follow the chat so you can follow it as well. I can start with the questions of Fania Shalim. Each generation is developing their own spirituality, but sometimes misunderstood happened among people from different generations, and the result is distance. Yeah. And does that has to do with the spirituality growth within the church? I think that indeed every generation develops its own way of dealing with things. And the problem is not that they do, the problem is that they do not talk about it intergenerationally. And what really happens is for the older ones, the wiser ones, to ask questions. Why do you think this is right? What do you believe? What are your core convictions in life? If older generations really listen priestly to the younger ones, it makes a huge difference. But then, because then the younger ones, and I'm of course, individuals always have tensions. I mean, that's something we cannot manage, but we can grow a culture of priestly listening to one another. And then we can ask, well, is this true? Is this the best way? Does it help you? And then a conversation is starting. That is the whole point of being a community of disciples. Then from Julian Herefa, good to listen to you, Arefa. I think we have, I cannot see who you are, but I think I know the name at least. There might be several Arefas, I don't know. Can an intergenerational education be an answer to overcome the gap? Well, it might help, but it's not a solution in any case. So that's the problem. It's not manageable. The only thing is that we should at least try. What kind of learning model? Well, I talked about that. Vertical connection and stratification horizontally is very important. If we want to really avoid, if we avoid the needs of Generation Z for 5 or 10 years, what effect will that have? Well, if you do not listen briefly to a generation and its own needs, they will start falling out. That is the problem in our culture. There is an option to change, to change faith in general, lose your faith, whatever. It's an option. And that makes it very hard. So really, we should listen and invest in listening to one another. That is very, very important. Juniawati Suhendra, family minister, is the perspective of the church leaders who sees more alienation to the younger generation, but also demanding them. Yes, that is demanding from a new generation, just asking them to do what you think they should do is not the right answer. Start with listening. And then you can focus on the shared needs. What do we both need and what do we both long for? And then a fruitful conversation can start. Could you tell us about secularism in your country? I did about the percentages, and I can share with you the facts if you want to. Following Osmer, Your President face many difficulties in the second and third steps. Yeah, what should be going on and what really should we then do? Because of the different generations, we have different opinions. And there is a continuing strive for what should be continued and what should be changed. Is everything negotiable within the church? No. But that is not something we should just state. I mean, of course, I believe in Jesus Christ and the vicarious dying of Jesus on the cross. And that is something I will not negotiate over and on. But still, if I encounter a young or a group of youngsters who doubt that, what does it bring if I say you are not allowed to talk about that? It doesn't help. They will still talk about it among each other. I'd rather I'd rather create an environment in which I can speak about all those things. And yes, it may be that then certainly some things appear to be more negotiable than I thought. For instance, the way in which we organize our church services. It might be the case that if I listen truly to younger generations, that I can more easily change things in my church service. Is that a problem? No. And if lots of people really demand a different stance towards ethical issues or doctrinal issues, that is something we should take our time for. It's not something that you discuss easily over 1 year. Those are real problems. So take your time. That is very important, because taking time with younger generations is a hard thing. They want things fast and tomorrow. Be then patient and loving and say, well, dear boy, dear girl, or young man, or whatever, this is not how it works in life. You can't grow a tree overnight. And if it has to be a very reliable, durable tree, it takes time. And you in Indonesia have more trees than we, and they really take a long time to grow. Do not skip that easily. I will go on.
Yes.
Is there how we can prevent conformity? Well, that is because that is very easy. If you have this learning and listening community, then there is no conformity imposed on one another. In the Jennifer Woolford, the context of postmodern era, concept of generation, because postmodern perspective imports of radical diversity. Yeah, if we take postmodernism seriously, is there any truth? Is there any categorization applicable? That is a very important question. But I do not think that we are victims of postmodernity. We all fall under the reign of God. And if God reigns over postmodernity, that is my anchor. That is my fixed point. And if God is concerned with individuals, with people, and if God is concerned with reconciling relations with himself and among people, that is something I should strive for. So yes, that is a helpful perspective, I think. God who reconciles with him and among one another. By Julius Samaremare. I'm sorry to pronounce your name so badly. Motivation. Okay, that's just a remark. the effort of the church in the Netherlands, especially Kampen, by implementing, that we already discussed, by Charlene, to Andar already an answer, by, dear Professor, thanks for the presentation. I'm reflecting your presentation in my mind. Enlightenment, secularization, rapid change. Could you please share with us what concept of progress education? I already talked about this.
Yep.
Nancy Suis, meal traditions. Yeah, great. Thank you. Please send me your articles if you want to. That is meal traditions, very important. Those are more like remarks than questions.
Yes. I think time is up, Professor Hans, but I think we cannot satisfy all participants answering the question. But thank you very much for your presentation. Before we close this session, would you like to give a closing statement? But 1 or 2 sentences.
Yes.
Okay, please.
Thank you very much. I want to really encourage you. You are responsible, as I am here in Kampen, you are responsible for so many students in so many churches, for so many individual Christians. And be sure that the God of life is guiding you, is blessing you. I really hope that you feel that he blesses you with the empowerment of his love to be loving and to listen to what people need and trying to give some answers.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hans. And give us applause to Professor Hans.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ibu dan Bapak, great changes have occurred in the world and in our society in Indonesia. And these rapid changes include the generation gap that has resulted many problems in society, churches, and in educational institutions. And these changes call for changes as well in the ways, strategies, methods of education, including in the church and in theological education. New wines need new wineskins. No one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the new wine will burst the skin. The wine will run out and the wineskins will be ruined. Ibu dan Bapak, terima kasih banyak untuk partisipasi pada sesi ini, and thank you very much, Professor Hans, for your presentation and the answers and comments. Terima kasih. Thank you. Thank you well. Ibu Lenta, saya berikan kembali puji hormat, kekuasaan, kemuliaan kepada Ibu Lenta. Terima kasih Ibu. Terima kasih Pak Han. Thank you very much, and Ibu Bapak sekalian. Tuhan memberkati.
Prof. Hans, danke well. So please kindly receive the appreciation of all of us. I will send you certification, but maybe in your email. And I will contact you soon. Thank you so much. Bapak dan Ibu, kita akan mengakhiri sesi yang terakhir hari ini dengan berdoa. Pak Pelita, masih ada kan Bapak? Bapak Pelita Surbakti dari STT Cipanas? Halo Pak Pelita. Apakah sudah
laptopnya ada, tapi orangnya belum tentu ada.
Ya, mungkin lagi ambil minum. Saya ingatkan sedikit Bapak Ibu, besok kita akan kembali berjumpa dengan waktu yang sama seperti hari ini dan kemarin. Jam 8 room akan kami buka. Jam 8.30 kita mulai diskusi kelompok. Hanya satu sesi saja diskusi kelompok. Dan ini sangat penting Bapak dan Ibu, karena hasil diskusi ditambah refleksi kita selama 2 hari ini akan menentukan apa hasil dari studi institut kita selama 3 hari. Jadi mohon Bapak Ibu yang tidak memiliki kesibukan urgen untuk dilakukan besok, berharap sekali boleh tetap bertahan di sesi pertama dan kedua. Jadi di sesi kedua kita akan plenokan, presentasikan semua hasil kelompok-kelompok, dan itu akan menjadi rekomendasi atau hasil studi institut tahun 2020 ini. Dan di akhir dari semuanya besok juga semoga tetap bertahan. Pak Yusak tadi mungkin tidak mendengar ya Pak. Jadi besok kita akan mengumumkan beberapa juara-juara dari kategori Pak. Misalnya peserta yang paling kontributif dalam diskusi kelompok, peserta paling awal hadir dalam room Zoom gitu ya. Belum jam 8 udah ketok-ketok gitu. Atau peserta paling aktif bertanya dari setiap sesi. Jadi saya dan beberapa pengurus akan bekerja malam ini untuk melihat-lihat sampai besok. Jadi semoga Bapak Ibu lebih bersemangat lagi untuk bertahan sampai besok. Karena ada kaos Persetia yang siap untuk dikirimkan kepada semua juara-juaranya.
Mohon maaf, pertanyaan begitu banyak sampai tidak sempat dibahas semuanya. Mohon maaf. Karena kayaknya banyak pertanyaan yang terlewatkan sepertinya. Iya. Terus Ibu Lenta.
Pak Surbakti, Pak Pelita Surbakti, sepertinya Pak Pelita harus digantikan oleh seorang yang lain. Bolehkah saya minta kesediaan Pak Agus Supriyadi?
Itu kayaknya sudah siap itu.
Pak Agus. Ada Pak Pelita.
Ya, tadi saya tidak diizinkan masuk.
Ya ampun.
Siapakah yang sangat kejam itu? Maaf Bapak.
Ya, saya sudah share di grup.
Aduh.
Minta tolong supaya diizinkan.
Pak Pelita, Pak Agus, mohon maaf Pak Agus. Berarti Pak Pelita ready. Aduh, ini hostnya terlalu kejam ya Pak, maafkan.
Ya, mari kita berdoa. Bapa yang di surga, kami bersyukur kepadamu oleh karena anugerah-Mu yang besar kepada kami. Engkau mengajak kami untuk bersama-sama belajar bersama melalui Studi Institut yang diselenggarakan oleh Persetia. Kami bersyukur untuk sesi-sesi yang boleh kami lalui dari pagi hingga sore hari ini. Kami berdoa ya Tuhan, waktu yang akan datang boleh kami pakai untuk menginternalisasi seluruh materi yang telah kami dengarkan, seluruh sharing yang telah kami dengarkan dari rekan-rekan dosen di berbagai STT. Kami berdoa ya Tuhan agar masa-masa kami merenung, akhirnya boleh kami ambil mana yang akan kami pakai untuk kami konstruk kembali di tempat kami masing-masing sesuai dengan keunikan sekolah kami masing-masing. Kami berdoa untuk setiap anak-anakku yang telah mengambil bagian di dalam setiap sesi, keberkati mereka agar di masa yang akan datang mereka juga boleh semakin menjadi berkat. Demikian juga para narasumber yang juga telah Engkau pakai untuk menolong kami. Tuhan, inilah dua ucapan syukur dan permohonan kami kepadamu ya Tuhan. Dalam nama Tuhan Yesus Kristus kami berdoa dan mengucap syukur. Amin.
Amin. Terima kasih Pak Pelita.
Terima kasih Bu Lenta, terima kasih Bapak Ibu semuanya. Bye-bye.
Terima kasih Bu Lenta, terima kasih.
Bu Lenta belum foto, Bu Lenta.
Terima kasih Lenta.
Foto katanya.
Bu Lenta belum foto sepanjang hari ini.
Bapak Ibu.
Udah pada pergi.
Prof Han, are you still there? Want to have a picture with you?
From Hans
sudah keluar. Udah live tadi.
Udah live ya.
Sayang sekali.
Ya sudah. Kirim foto di grup aja Bu.
Ya. Seadanya saja. Tak adanya.
Slide-nya di-remove, Dek. Saya ambil foto Bapak dan Ibu.
Ya.
Dek, spotlight-nya di-remove dong.
Ada 6 lembar ya ini.
Nggak bisa.
Senyum yang terbaik dan termanis.
Ibu senyum yang paling manis. Dan ditahan agak lama karena ada 5 layar.
Dan ada hadiahnya. Senyum yang paling manis ada hadiahnya.
Dan kalau bisa jangan ada yang kirim chat dulu, karena nanti akan tercapture dalam. Oke. Bapak Ibu saya hitung ya. Senyumnya ditahan agak lama. Ini layar pertama.
Sampai gigi kering.
Yang kedua.
Siapa tuh?
Yang kedua 1, 2, 3.
Hah?
Yang ketiga 1, 2, 3. Yang keempat.
Jangan dipoto ini.
1, 2.
Wajahnya udah ngantuk semua.
Sekali lagi Pak, layar kelima Pak, sabar Pak. 1, 2, 3. Oke.